Hi everybody, apologies for the long break since my last video. I've just been writing a bit more for the blog lately and just had a lot going on in the rest of my life. So videos have taken a slight backseat to everything else going on. But today's topic that I wanted to talk about is something that really pisses me off a lot, which is where you see all of these sort of arguments online that are basically like, okay, what is the most impressive sport? Not necessarily who are the most impressive athletes, but basically just, like all this stuff that's endless fighting about, okay, bodybuilding is better than powerlifting, or powerlifting is better than bodybuilding, or CrossFit is better than this, or, CrossFitters are all weak, or, bad, or whatever. There's a lot of sort of this infighting between different lifting sports just in terms of, okay, what is the best lifting sport? And so kind of a very classic example that I want to bring up is basically in 1993, basically there's two athletes, Tom Platz, really legendary bodybuilder, known for having some of the best quads, best leg development of all time. He also used to supposedly have a very absurd training scheme where he would basically just train legs an absurd amount compared to, what most people could actually handle. And then there was also Fred Hatfield, the first guy to squat 1,000 pounds, one of the best powerlifters in the world. And so basically the story goes, in 1993, the two of them decided to have a competition between the two of them to see who was better at squatting. What ended up happening was that while Tom Platz had bigger legs, he, clearly did not have as high of a 1 RM as Fred Hatfield did. Fred Hatfield managed to put up 855 pounds compared to Tom putting up 765 pounds. However, when they took some plates off the bar, decreased the weight, and they decided to do like a rep out, which would be something more in, sort of a bodybuilder's, sort of wheelhouse, basically what ended up happening was they took the plates off the bar, decreased the weight to 525 for a test of endurance, and at this time, Tom Platz is the one who won the day, coming up with 23 reps compared to Fred Hatfield just coming up with 11. So it's very clear, based on these two athletes, that, they trained very differently for very different results. Fred Hatfield trained to be very good at having a very high 1 rep max. It did not train endurance very much, and as a result, he had a very high 1 rep max, but he suffered when it came to the endurance competition. Meanwhile, on the other end, you have Tom Platz, who basically, again, does not necessarily need to train for strength. He was training for size. So he did have, much greater endurance and was able to do a lot more reps at, what people would still consider to be a really impressive weight. 525 pounds is still more weight than I can do for a single repetition. So, whatever. This is all, sort of silly to me. So the question is, who is more impressive? Which is better? And of course, the answer is that neither of them is better. People just tend to train for the sorts of things that they need to be able to do in their sport. And, that doesn't necessarily mean that sport is better or worse than any other sport, or that they're necessarily better or worse athletes overall. That's just sort of the consequence of having to train, the kind of way that you train in order to get the results that you want to get out of your training. So to kind of go into, basically just an overview of each of the lifting sports, obviously bodybuilding is a sport where you are just trying to get as big as possible. And that's actually two different phases more than anything else. It is bulking, which is basically putting on muscle mass, training to, build as much size as you can. And then it's also cutting, because you want to look as impressive as you can. You don't want to, be big, but also be carrying a lot of fat mass. And so the cutting phase is basically just cutting off all that fat mass so that you can be as lean as possible, of course, so that when you go into competition, you look as, as impressive as you can. There's nothing in bodybuilding that says that you need to be able to perform well. You don't have to have super good endurance. You don't have to have super good strength. You just have to have those big muscles and that good definition. So, basically any kind of performance markers are just sort of secondary to what you look like. And then secondly, of course, powerlifting. Powerlifting is a sport where, you are trying to get as strong as you can in the squat, the bench press, and the deadlift, 3 different lifts. And so what you're going to do is you're going to focus on basically just training, fewer reps overall, higher intensity, more weight, and just training to get as strong as you can in those 3 lifts. And maybe you'll train, obviously some other lifts that will help you assist those lifts in terms of maybe whatever your weak points are. And of course, yeah, you're going to train a little bit to build some muscle, because in the long run, building muscle means that you can help, that can help you lift more weight in the long run. So you are going to be doing some focusing on building muscle, but of course not nearly as much as the bodybuilder is. Then, of course, we have weightlifting. Weightlifting is very similar to, sort of the format of powerlifting, in that you're trying to get as strong as you can. But this time it's just in 2 lifts, which we call the Olympic lifts, which are the snatch and the clean and jerk. And so this is a very different sort of, strength, simply because the lifts themselves are very different. It's kind of, it would take a whole other video to sort of get into sort of the nitty gritty of why these lifts are different than the squat, bench, and deadlift. But needless to say, they're both very difficult full body lifts that require a lot of explosive power in addition to being strong. And so it's not quite the same kind of training, even though it is somewhat similar. It's a lot more technique focused. You need a lot more, sort of flexibility and mobility and stability to be able to do these lifts well. And so, in many cases, weightlifters may have, sort of, a little bit more adaptable, overall in terms of the qualities that they need compared to a powerlifter who's going to be, mostly just focused on strength. So then there is strongman. And this is something that I think is actually really interesting, because strongman was basically invented to be a spectacle. It was never originally intended to be its own sport. The whole concept of strongman was that you would take these bodybuilders, these powerlifters, these weightlifters, all these different strength athletes from all these different sports, and you would put them together to see who generally performed the best, doing odd lifts that basically none of these other sports, trained regularly. The idea was that this would be fair, because, obviously, in the example above, if you're taking a bodybuilder and you're telling him to do a 1RM, obviously the powerlifter is going to beat him out, so there's no point in doing that. So instead what you do is you find something that both the bodybuilder and the powerlifter will theoretically be somewhat good at, but also that, neither one of them is necessarily going to have any advantage. And so, they invented all these weird lifts, lifting stones, throwing things, doing rep outs, doing car deadlifts, pulling things, yokes, and, all sorts of other things that basically the idea was that no one would be any good at. And initially that was, what it was basically this contest designed to test these different strength sports and pit them against each other to see who was doing the best. And of course, sometimes it would be bodybuilders and sometimes it would be powerlifters. It was all very sort of, it was all just very dependent on, who the actual athletes were and kind of what other stuff they did in their training aside from what they really needed to focus on. Now, of course, what ended up happening was that over time, those events started to become set in stone. You started to have a certain handful of events that got used over and over again. People started training specifically for strongman, which sort of defeats the point of making it this, this contest between different sports, between different athletes from different sports. And so it became its own sport. And something that I think is interesting about strongman is that I would say that it's a little bit more of an overall athletic sport than, actually most other lifting sports, because there's actually a wide variety of different qualities that you're trying to train here. Yes, everything is biased towards actually being, as strong as you can, but not the way that powerlifting is, where you're just trying to be, super strong. Not the way that weightlifting is, where you're just trying to be super strong in, a few different lifts. Strong men, they are trying to be strong, but they also have to have endurance. They also have to have a lot more conditioning. They also have to be able to deal with, moving these odd weights and sort of dealing with these challenges that, maybe, that you don't normally see all the time in the gym. And so strongman is actually a little bit superior of a sport in that way. It actually is. Again, it's all the same in the end. No sport is better than any other, but strongman is definitely a sport that requires a little bit more sort of breadth of skill as opposed to just being really good at one or, just a few things. And so, it's a little weird because strongman used to skew heavyweight. That's how it started off. Basically they didn't have weight classes for a long time. And so what ended up happening was that just incentivized guys to get as big as possible, so that they could move as much weight as possible. And so, it turned into a very super heavyweight sport. More recently, what's ended up happening, of course, is that they have started adding in weight classes. People at, lower body weights are able to compete against people, in their own weight class. And that has made the sport a lot more diverse in terms of, sort of just, how many people can compete in it. And so it is interesting because, again, it's called strongman, but that is a bit of a misnomer nowadays because it's actually more endurance focused than powerlifting and weightlifting ever are. So that is what it is. And then we have CrossFit. CrossFit is, of course, the new one, the one that everyone loves to hate on. CrossFit is sort of designed to be a jack of all trades thing. The whole guiding principle of CrossFit is that you want to be good at everything. And so, more so than strongman, CrossFit really leans into trying to do everything at once. You have to be strong, you have to have good endurance, you have to have good mobility, you have to be trained in, all sorts of different movements that include gymnastics and calisthenics and, weightlifting and powerlifting and, typical strongman stuff as well. You have to be, sort of a little bit good at everything. And, that is what it is. Like it's, typically you're going to see that, CrossFit athletes may be really good at branching out into sort of these other lifting sports if they're really good athletes. But in a general sense, they're not going to be, necessarily as strong as a power lifter. They're not necessarily going to be as jacked as a bodybuilder. They're not necessarily going to, be as good with the weightlifting lifts as weightlifters. But it is sort of a jack of all trades sport. And, that is what it is. Again, it's not that you're better for, doing all these things. It's just that you're focusing more of your energy on, a wider variety of things as opposed to just focusing on a few things and getting as good as possible at them. And of course, yes, there was this old, the old argument that was like CrossFit kills your gains. You can't build any muscle mass from CrossFit. That's of course not true. That's just a dumb myth that, the internet created and, doesn't seem to want to die. So it is what it is. So, comparing all these sports, which one of is the best, which is the best sport? The answer is obviously none of them. That just is what it is. Each sport is going to have its own strengths and weaknesses. The lifters who compete in that sport are going to need to train to maximize their performance in that sport because different sports require different things out of your body. That just means that you're going to adapt in different directions. You only have so much effort to focus on your training. You have a theoretical, I have a theoretical energy pool, in my life that's made up of sort of the amount of time, the amount of willpower that I have to dedicate to training. And I can choose to spend 100% of that focusing on powerlifting. I could choose to spend 50% of that on powerlifting, 50% on bodybuilding. I could choose to spend 100% of that on CrossFit. It's about how you allocate the energy you have and, just what you care about, what you focus on and sort of what your goals are. Obviously, you want to train for, you want to use training methods that are effective for the goals that you want to accomplish. And so, of course, if you're going to be a powerlifter, then that means you're probably not going to be any good at going for a run. It means you're probably not going to have great endurance. But that doesn't mean powerlifters are bad. It just means that that's sort of the, that is what it is. That's the choice, the trade-off that you've made by choosing to focus on powerlifting. And any sport can be overdone to the point where it is unhealthy for your body. Basically, if you push things really hard, you're increasing your risk of injury, you're increasing your risk of, sort of long-term health issues, especially if you are going to choose to take performance-enhancing drugs. And so, yes, like any sport can be taken to an extreme. You can argue and argue and argue about which sports are actually safer or less safe. The reality is that actually training in the gym is still way safer than any kind of contact sport. I don't think people realize this. Like basically any contact sport in the world is going to be far more likely to injure you than going to the gym and training, where basically, when you're training in the gym, you have almost complete control over the kind of stimulus that you're placing on your body. And that means that your chance of actually, seriously hurting yourself in the gym, especially if you are smart about it and take lots of precautions, is actually incredibly small. Even going for a run can sometimes be more damaging to your body, in the long run than simply, training for a lifting sport. Again, depending on how much you push it and so on. So no athlete is going to be a complete master of everything, not even CrossFitters, as much as, they aspire to be that. Again, you only have so much energy to put in your training week, and that means that you just allocate your energy into the things that you care about, and hopefully you get those results back. So I think that comparing athletes from different sports is a huge waste of time. It's an apples to oranges comparison. I just think that you should let people enjoy themselves, let them train however they want to train, and, just let things all shake out. So that is my video for this week. I hope you really liked it. As always, if you liked this video, don't hesitate to like, comment, subscribe. Tell me what you want to see in future videos, and I will talk to you all next week. Have a good one.